So I'm trying to remember exactly how I ordered this. It's late, y'all. It's late. Okay. All right, I'm remembering now. All right, so the main reason the argument don't make sense, and there's layers to it, but the real big overall reason is that by definition of ego, it just doesn't make sense. Like, it's even, no disrespect, but real talk, it's even a dumb sentence to make. It's a dumb question to ask. Does the black female have an ego? Like, by definition of ego, that's just a dumb question to ask. It doesn't make any sense. And why is this? Well, there's two definitions of the word ego. The first one is the spiritual definition of ego. That's what I'll call it. And then the second one is the casual definition of ego. And the truth of the matter is that saying that black women have an ego doesn't make sense no matter which of those two definitions you use. Okay. And well, before I get into that, I want to show y'all another clip from Brother Omawale's first video on the black female ego. I'm actually in this clip, but this one is at about the 2-hour mark of this 2-hour 43-minute live stream. Just past the 2-hour mark here. For context, I got up on his live stream and was kind of saying why I didn't agree, and he pushed back, and I didn't get to fully finish my point. No shade, but I didn't. But really, I basically asked him which definition of the word ego he was using, because that would be key to understanding what he was trying to say. And he gave his answer, but again, no disrespect, but he's really kind of trying to have it both ways with his answer, and I'll explain why in a second. But let's hold up. I want to get it at like 5:30. All right, I'll just start it here.
Well, definitely let her up because I appreciate her perspective. But the panel is now closed. So thank you, RM, for moderating the chat tonight. So go ahead, Brother Chimobe, and then I'll bring you to.
So on the topic of ego, we have to acknowledge there's a difference between ego in like the spiritual sense and ego and how it's commonly used. And I think in this context, we're talking about ego and how it's commonly used, and that really just means overconfidence, inflated self-worth. Correct me if I'm wrong, Brother Amwala, but I assume that was the general sense how you're using ego.
I'm actually not, because I think that also from a spiritual perspective, like one could argue that your ego is your sense of kind of, it's like it's not. So you get me into like the esoteric and the philosophical now, because now we're starting to have questions about the real self. Like basically, the ego is the false self. The ego is the created self that we all develop to navigate the world. And the ego is where all of our trauma and our feelings about things is housed, right? So in terms of, when people talk about like protecting the ego, it's like basically what you're doing is you're not trying to show your true wounded self to the world. A perfect example of this, right? When we talk about like the ego being the false self, I've noticed a lot of brothers as of late have been using their art to talk about the importance of killing the ego, right? Jay-Z's 444, he reached a point of marital crisis. The first song on his album is Kill Jay-Z. Kendrick Lamar reached a point of relational crisis in his battle with sex addiction. He's talking about the killing of the ego and battling with father issues. T.I. is just going through a significant public crisis and scandal with his partner. His next album is called Kill the King. So it's about killing this false self, right, that we create to interface with the world so that our real self, connected self that does not need to dominate and control others, that true self can come out. And what I'm
Okay.
arguing is that fake self of the black woman is being inflated, by people external to their group for their interests, not for the interests of black women or the black community.
Their inner Karen is being
Okay.
inflated.
Okay, well, what I'll say is if you're using ego in that sense, and I was familiar with that definition, I would argue that this conversation is way more complicated because even with talking about the ego in the spiritual sense, because there's not even you don't even just have one ego, but whether or not that's even good or bad is even a conversation. But I'll kind of leave that alone. What I previously said, I think stands, but all right, I'll stop it there. Then I kind of said more stuff after that. But the whole point I'm making here is that Brother Omowale said that the ego he was talking about was this first ego, which is the first definition of ego, sorry, which is the spiritual meaning of the word ego. However, when we look at the actual spiritual meaning of the word ego, that can't really make sense. Because again, the spiritual definition of ego, as he said in that clip, is basically the false self. And this is really complicated. I'm going to do a lecture in the future about egos in depth because it's a really deep topic. But basically, long story short, everyone has a real self. That's your real true personality, your real true desires, all of that. And that's given to you by your creator. Your creator made that. Then you have a bunch of false selves and you created those yourself. And basically you create those to protect your real self, right? And everyone doesn't just have one ego. I mean, maybe in theory it's possible for someone to have one ego, but in reality, basically no one does. Virtually everyone, if not literally every single person, has multiple egos. And these egos aren't necessarily good or bad, right? These false selves aren't necessarily good or bad. Because I think usually in common conversation, when you hear the term false self, you always think, oh, that's bad, but it's not necessarily bad. For example, a good false self could be someone who's really a soft guy, right? Say he's walking through a busy street, but then he kind of, you know, walks in a way and gives off a vibe to make himself look tough. And that's actually a good ego because there's protecting him. Because if he actually went out on the street giving off energy like his true wimpy self, he'd probably get robbed or beat up, right? So in that case, the false self he's putting on is a good thing. But of course, it can also be bad, right? An example of a bad ego, a bad false self, would be a teenager pretending that they like to do drugs just so they can hang out with the cool kids, right? So maybe the cool kids, whoever they think of the cool kids at their high school, are, doing some crazy drugs, and his real self doesn't like that. Internally, he's really like inside himself, he's really like, I don't want to do that, but then he wants to be popular, so he pretends like, oh yeah, I'm down with it, and then he goes and does that, and 20 years later, he one of them junkies who's always at the train station, right? So that's an example of a bad ego, a bad false self. And the whole thing I'm trying to say is that you know egos can be either good or bad, and everyone has them. So because of that, saying that someone has an ego, if you're talking about the spiritual sense of ego, really doesn't make any sense, right? That's like saying, I'm sorry, I don't know why this thing is in the way. Is there a okay? This is it's not, why is this in the way? I'm sorry, because y'all are missing out on those words there. But saying that someone has an ego, okay, it went away. Saying that someone has an ego, in the spiritual sense, is like saying that someone has a heart, saying that someone has a brain. It's like saying that someone has lungs. It was pretty meaningless. Everyone has those, and that doesn't say whether or not it's good or bad. It doesn't say what you need to do with the ego. So the way we usually talk about the word ego and the way it's being talked about throughout this series doesn't make sense for the spiritual meaning of ego, right? You if you just say, oh, we're confronting this person's ego in the spiritual sense, it's like, okay, one, why are you doing that? Two, which ego? Like, it just, it's pretty meaningless. It's real vague at best, but then it's kind of meaningless at worst, right? But again, the way they were talking about the ego, it was pretty clear they were actually using the second definition of ego, which is the casual meaning of the word ego. And the casual definition of ego is just self-confidence, right? That's the casual definition of ego. And casually, when we say that someone has an ego, we talk about having an ego, what we're really saying is that someone's being overconfident or arrogant, right? And that's what they were saying, because they were saying that in the whole argument, that black women, in their eyes, you know, think they're so emotionally intelligent and so smart and so much more educated and so much richer than black men, and you know they're what is it, the I'm sorry, I'm sorry, that they're talking so much about how they're getting gassed up by liberals, white liberals. They're getting Black Lives Matter money, all this stuff, that they think that their poo poo don't stink. All right, and when you're saying that, you're talking about the casual meaning of ego. And like, to be fair, you could say that, okay, it's possible for one of someone's egos to be a really overconfident person. Like, one of your false selves could be an overconfident person. Okay, but that, again, that if you're talking about ego in the spiritual sense and not the casual sense, it doesn't make sense to use that normal language. You'd have to use a lot more nuance. You'd have to be a lot more careful. You'd have to add a lot more detail to what you're saying. But the kind of rather vague way they were talking about ego is really in line with the casual meaning of ego. But I think now, on to why it doesn't make sense specifically, is that whether or not you want to say they were talking about the casual version of ego, or they're like, you want to say no, they're talking about the spiritual version of ego, but they're just saying that in particular, all black women, have a spiritual ego that is just overconfident, and looking down on black men relative to themselves. um that that just doesn't make any sense, because there's just a whole lot of evidence to say that that's not true, right? Because first of all, there's just a mountain of evidence that black women, like all black people, have low self-esteem compared to all non-blacks. All right, so if you want to single out black women for having an ego, you're gonna have to single out the whole planet too, because their self-confidence is lower than everyone else's. You could argue, I mean, I think black men have an equally low self-confidence. But again, if you're tied for bottom, can we say you have a big ego? Because that's another thing. I think I forgot to add on the slide, but in this casual meaning of ego, it's that, like, when you say someone has an ego, you're comparing them to other people. That's the other main reason it didn't make sense to say they were using the spiritual definition of ego, because that the phrase that someone has an ego, or that their ego is inflated, right? That's comparing them to other people, right? And when you're talking about the spiritual definition of ego, uh, that it's really hard. It doesn't really make sense to compare your spiritual ego to other people's egos like that. You know, if you're gonna make comparisons between two different people's egos in the spiritual sense, uh you gotta be a lot more specific with your language because it's just way more complicated. um you know, what is it in the spiritual sense? What does it even mean to have a big ego? Like, what is it? You know, egos aren't like physical things. They exist in the spiritual world, so it's like they don't really have a mass. You know what I mean? They don't like weigh anything. So what does it mean to have a big spiritual ego? You know, that it just kind of doesn't really make sense. That's just not how you talk about that. It doesn't make sense. So anyway, this language of someone having an inflated ego, of, you know, someone having a big ego, someone having, you know, all that type of stuff really only makes sense with the casual meaning of ego. And if you're just trying to say that, use all this ego language to say that black women are overconfident and, you know, looking down on black men, it just doesn't add up. Because again, if you compare them to other races, their self-confidence and self-esteem is way lower, right? There's just a mountain of evidence. I'll just give a couple examples, but you know, we all know this, right? For example, there have been lots of studies done that show that the lighter someone is, the less likely they are to move out of your way when they're walking on the street. So the logical conclusion of that is that black women would be less likely, or would be more likely than any other race of women, to move out of your way when you're on the street, right? Because these other races believe that their ego is so big in the casual sense, they're so overconfident, they think, well, you got to move out of my way because I'm the ish. Okay, and black women are not thinking like that. All right, to the same extent, and the same thing goes for men, right? So this is just a race wide thing. um no ego there. Then also when it comes to money, other races just feel entitled to be richer than blacks, right? To the point where, you know, if a white person sees that a black person has more money than them, they'll get upset. But, you know, black people don't really get mad just at the fact that a white person is richer than them, right? To the same extent, right? There've been a lot of research to show this, and these are just two examples, right? They apply to black women like all black other black people. So off the face of that, you can't say that black women have an ego. Then another thing is that, you know, black women, like all black people, suffer from a lot of self-hate, which also ties in with this thing. An example of this you can see in terms of, you know, how black women give into racist beauty standards. You know, skin bleaching is big, unfortunately. Not wearing natural hair is big, right? So there's a lot of using relaxers, wearing weaves, wearing straight haired wigs, you know, putting straight fake hair on the braids to make it longer so it imitates white people's hair a bit more, right? There's a lot of that. You know, you just see also general uh, bad beliefs about black people, right? Because, you know, just like all black people, black women are more likely than women of other races to, you know, believe bad things about their own race and act against their own race. So, for example, right, we have Candace Owens. There's no white equivalent of Candace Owens, right? There's no white woman who's just out here betraying white people for black people, right? So again, right, when you see things like that happening, right, can you say that that group of people have an ego? And again, these things I've listed, I'm not singling black women out among all black people because all black people have this, right? Black men also have this, comes out in its own way among black men, right? My point is, right, if you know this is true of all black people, and you see the evidence of how it comes up both for everyone, but then also each gender, you can't then say that Black women have a big ego in the casual sense, right? Doesn't make sense. And then also we know about all the negative, um, you know, all the negative media attention that Black women do get, all the negative criticism Black women do get in society, from like, the Jezebel stereotype saying that Black women are all, immoral when it comes to, um, well, I don't want to say it on stream because a bunch of Puritans run this platform. But when it comes to sex, saying that Black women are all moral when it comes to that. Then also like stereotypes about the welfare queen, baby mamas with multiple kids from different dads. All those stereotypes are everywhere about Black women. So you can't, again, leading into the next point, right? You can't say that non-Black people overall really be pandering to Black women like that. Yes, Democrats recently have been pandering to Black women, and that's what Brother Omawale and the other people were talking about when they brought up like Black Lives Matter a lot. They brought up certain companies giving grants to uh, black female led organizations. They talked about you know Black feminism. They talked about like they mentioned certain catchphrases that have become popular, like Black Girl Magic. By the way, I don't have a problem with. um you know sure, some people might use that and have a bad intention, but the phrasing of itself ain't bad. That one's really not that deep. But anyway, they brought up all that stuff, and even talked about how Black women get praised a lot for voting Democrat, but Black men, get real criticized real hard for not voting Democrat enough, even though we vote Democrat more than almost anyone else, right? It's only Black women who vote Democrat at a higher rate. So, say all this to say, yeah, Democrats have been pandering to Black women uh, recently. I mean, you could argue they started a bit a few decades ago, but I think it only really went completely crazy the last few years. I would probably say since Trump got elected. So that's like 6 years, right? Um, but that doesn't change all the other stuff I mentioned, right? The Democrats are not the only powerful non-blacks, right? Because again, you got all the Republicans, then you got just non-white people in general. You got East Asians, you got West Asians, right? Like Arabs. None of those other people be pandering to Black women like that, right? And so you can't just say just because one group of non-blacks panders to Black women that the entire social narrative about Black women is positive, right? It's not. It's just not. Um, then on top of that, right, even some of the things they mentioned, like nonprofit money going to Black women, that shit, that, sorry, I don't want to curse, get the stream taken down, or, have the algorithm kill it. But, nonprofit money probably ain't going to too many Black women. We know white people are funny when it comes to money. Okay, so they could say, "Oh, we gave 100 million to certain Black women." They could just use some, some, as we say in Nigeria, kana, have it go to other white people, right? Have it go to an organization that's supposedly full of Black women, but it's not, right? And even how many Black women even work for nonprofit companies? Like, so again, I could go on and on, but I think y'all get what I'm putting down here. Overall, it just doesn't make sense to say that the pandering that the Democrats are doing uh, by itself means Black women have privilege and that no one is hating on them anymore. or that they're overall getting more love than black men, because and particularly that is like developed into an ego and overconfidence, right? When you compare them to other people. And I really want to say it's important that you can't just say, you can't make an argument like, oh, black women are less confident than other people, but they're still overconfident because everyone's overconfident. Because then the question is, why would you single them out? Why would you only focus on them if everyone was confident? So clearly, if you're even bringing up this conversation, you're saying they're worse than normal. And that's just clearly not true. I think I made my point here. And then to continue with this, I want to say that Brother Omawale and the other people who got up there and agreed with him were clearly talking about a certain type of black woman who does exist, right? Specifically, they're talking about like bougie, college educated Western black women who are like feminists, um, or or just general man haters, right? As people who speak Latin would say, misandrists, right? Uh, so that those type of women do exist, but they're a tiny minority of all the black women on the planet, right? Because first of all, they're a minority in the U.S. I'm gonna zoom out a bit because we're gonna go to Google, do a little math. But these type of black women he's talking about, these bougie, college educated, real super feminist, super liberal black women who, probably, be hating on black men. They're a tiny minority of all black women, right? The first reason they're a minority is let's just look at the US first, because Brother Omawale, to my knowledge, uh, really only talking about black, or really only interacting with and observing black women who live in the US, maybe a bit online. He's seen some people in other parts of the West, like Canada, UK, but based on what he said, right, he's only been to Africa once. I don't know how much he's been to the Caribbean, but I mean, he lives in the US, right? So that's primarily who he's going to interact with. So let's just look at the US black woman population, because I think that's kind of who, he was interacting with that triggered this conversation, at least a section of them, right? These kind of bougie black women that Brother Omawale and co were talking about, they're a minority in the US, right? Because these type of black women, where did they come from? Because your normal, everyday, regular black woman is not out here using all these Greek and Latin words and quoting all these random authors, quoting bell hooks. They ain't doing that, right? So, and that's just not natural. Even you hear the way they talk, that's not how black women naturally talk, with all they talking at 100 miles an hour, sound like Julius Caesar, they speak in so much Latin. That's not how a normal black woman talks, even in the US, right? So, where did these people who do that come from? They go to college, and specifically, they're either going to one, PWIs, that's primarily white institutions, or in other words, just white colleges. So, one, they either go to white colleges, or two, they be going to the elite HBCUs. So, I'm talking like Howard, Spelman, what's the other one? Maybe like Hampton counts. Uh, like your real top tier HBCUs, that real bougie blacks, think like Jack and Jill people, the kinds that those people send their kids to. Those are the HBCUs they go to. Not even all HBCUs, all right? You ain't go find too many of these type of super bougie, super feminist, super liberal, super man hating black women at like a regular or like lower tier HBCU. You're not, right? Now let's look at some statistics about black women in college in the US. right? Um, so according to this, and I'll probably post, let me go ahead and post this article in here too. Uh, this is just one article giving these stats, but if you look up statistics about black women and graduating from college and attending college, um, you know, all the sources you find will tell you basically the same thing, right? I've looked into this deeply before, right? So according to the Education Trust, right? Let's look at it. All right. So what they're doing here is they're comparing the rate at which white women graduate college to the rate at which black women graduate college. They did the same thing for men, right? But here they go. So this is in the US, right? As of what year did they say this was as of? It is recent, but I don't. Okay, this was published in 2021. So it's like as of 2021, things ain't gonna have changed too much in 1 year, right? So slightly more than half of white women, 51.4%, have a college degree, compared to 36.1% of black women. 36.1%. So what does that mean? Out of all the black women in the US, only 36.1% have a college degree. That means that only about 1 out of every 3 black women has some sort of college degree, right? So if only 1 in 3 about are graduating college, you can't have a situation where the majority of black women are these bougie, super liberal, super feminist girls, right? Or women. I mean, not be disrespectful, women, right? Um, right? Because bougie women like that ain't dropping out like crazy. Because I think I might have seen some stats that suggest most black women enroll in college, but a lot drop out. Although I've seen other stats that say most don't even enroll, right? But certainly it's not girls dropping out of college. It ain't bougie women dropping out of college like that. Bougie women finish. All right, Jack and Jill kids finish. All right, if your dad was a doctor, you're gonna finish college. All right, and so we have to say that the vast majority of the kind of women that Brother Omawale is talking about, they would graduate college. So they're in that 36.1%. But then even when you break down that 36.1%, because again, remember what I said, those type of black women, they're either coming from PWIs, the elite HBCUs. That 36.1%, that's going to include black women who graduated from your regular or lower down HBCUs. It's also going to include black women who graduated from community college. All right. You ain't have none of these crazy bougie people graduating community college. So the number of women who are even potentially that, it's a minority of American black women. And that's before you even get to the fact that not all the black women who graduate from PWIs or these elite HBCUs even turn out like those people. Not all of them end up as these crazy, super feminist man haters who think that, you know, like they can do no wrong and that black men are beneath them. All right, that just ain't the case. Um, it's just not the case. Maybe most of them are feminists. I guess probably most of that category are feminists, but not all feminists, even though I don't agree with feminism as an ideology, right? It obviously there's some truth to it, but there's a lot of flaws. But that'll be a different lecture. But there's different points of view among feminists, right? So they're not not all of them believe the things that these kind of women that Brother Omawale is talking about believe. So all in all, no matter how you look at it, even within the US, these women are a minority of black women, right? A minority. Way less than 1/3. So what does that mean? You probably have 60 something, 70% of black women at least in the US alone who are not like this. I think is probably even higher. Like I would be shocked if even uh 20% of black women in the US were like this, okay? But this is just looking at the US. Because what we have to keep in mind is that black women don't only live in the US. Black people are all over the world. And the black people in the US are less than 4% of all the black people in the world, all right? I think black people who live in America usually forget that because Americans in general be real arrogant, be real self centered, right? No matter what your race. Obviously, you know, the higher up on that racial ladder you are, the worse you get this. So white Americans the worst, black Americans the least bad, but black Americans can still kind of fall into this. And one consequence of that is we forget that we are a tiny percentage of all the black people on earth, less than 4%. Let's do the math. So, sorry, let me share my screen as we do some math, right? And wow, it's approaching 1 a.m. But how many? Don't worry, we're rounding up, guys. We are rounding up.